Hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing really well. Today I'm going to be wrapping up everything that I read in the month of May, and then I'll go through my maybe rather over ambitious plans for June. In terms of quality, quantity, my overall enjoyment, May was a really good reading month. I was on the whole reading a lot of shorter books, so I finished a total of 11 books in May, which sounds preposterous, but a lot of them were much shorter. So far this year, each month I've been reading at least one book that was, at least about 1,000 pages, if not longer. And I didn't really do this month. I finished off a couple of longer books, but most of the reading had been done in April, if not earlier. And so really or the best part of my reading was of quite short books of about 200 pages and thereabouts. I tried to film this before, and I didn't mention all 11 books, and I also went on for ages, so I'm going to try to be a little more succinct with what I say about the books, and I'll do my best to actually include them all. I'll start off with 4 books that I've already mentioned in a random reading update video that I made towards the beginning of the month, sort of approaching the halfway mark. The first book is a non-fiction, and a good proportion of what I read this last month was non-fiction, which was really quite fun. But the first one to mention is Lives of the Poets by Michael Schmidt, and just sort of very briefly to mention what it is. It's a history of poetry in English, starting in the Middle Ages, going through to the sort of mid 1990s when the book was written. And I think if you're a fan of poetry or you're interested in poetry, you'll really enjoy it. And certainly a lot of the fun is seeing the overall development and sort of just seeing how poetry changes over time, how certain poets influence other poets and things like that. However, you might be able to go through the table of contents, and if there's a poet that you're interested in, maybe just see what he has to say. It's probably not the best way to read it because he's not always the most comprehensive about all poets. But yeah, certainly it's a great way to get to know some new poets that maybe you haven't heard of, or to sort of reassess and get excited about poets that you may have already been familiar with, but you just haven't read for some time. And with that in mind, that the next thing that I finished was The Night is Darkening Round Me, a slim selection of Emily Bronte's poems. And again, it came just from reading Lives of the Poets. It reminded me how much I loved Emily's poetry, and I just wanted to recapture that and see if the magic was sort of still there for me, and it was. An interesting fact I found out just from somewhere here, so just in some of the information at the beginning of the book. Initially, it's just saying which edition of the selected poems of Emily Brontë these poems are from and all of that. But then it also says the poem, often rebuked yet always back returning, is now widely felt to be by Charlotte Brontë, but is too wonderful to be excluded, which is really interesting. That's one of my favourites in here, and it's now widely considered to be a Charlotte Brontë poem, not a Emily Brontë poem. Next up, to mention briefly, Inventing the Enemy by Umberto Eco. Just some really entertaining essays on everything, as it says on the cover. He's just a lot of fun on the page. You're never sure where his mind is going to turn next. Some of the essays were more interesting than others. I suppose it probably just depends where your interest lies. But he's talking about ancient, sort of cartography and astronomy, What else is there? There's an essay about the sort of excessive style in Victor Hugo's writing. There's an essay on censorship. There's a very interesting one on Ulysses, and it's written from the perspective of a fascist censor um, in Italy when the book would have sort of first come out, which was really quite interesting, and sort of looking at a book that to some might be quite familiar through some very different eyes. It was quite entertaining. And then I also read The Stronghold by Dino Buzzati, which is a great, um, I think, really magical, kind of existential story about a soldier who goes up to a fortress in the mountains, and it's about sort of waiting for. I've heard someone say that it's kind of like Henry James, The Beast in the Jungle. It's kind of like the Castle by Franz Kafka. There's this possibility of something important happening, and yet you're never sure when it's going to happen or if it will really happen. And that's sort of the magic and also what's kind of so disturbing and um, I don't know. You can also sort of sympathise to it, I suppose, as well as a reader, because um, sometimes life can feel like that, I suppose. And then next up, I've got the Diaries of Franz Kafka. I've been sort of mentioning this here and there as I've been making my way through. I started it, I think, at the end of December, and I've just been slowly dipping in and out of them over the last few months. So I don't really know how to summarize it, how to talk about it, but it was really interesting. It still feels like Kafka on the page. I think for Kafka super fans, it's definitely something that you'd want to look into. Then I also read Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. This is a translation by Alan Russell, and I read this along with Sean D. Standfast. He wanted to reread it, and he'd seen that I wanted to read it, and so we gave it a go and had a reread. He wasn't quite so impressed with it the second time round, and I think I kind of had mixed feelings. Overall, the kind of overall reading experience, the writing and everything was lovely. So I would say that I enjoyed it, but I couldn't help thinking at certain points in the novel that it just feels like another 19th century novel. There's not a lot here that, at least to me, looking back at it, distinguishes it from other 19th century writers. And I think that might at least be partly due to how influential this book was. And so lots of people are sort of taking things from Flaubert's, from his book, and and so it's very familiar to me. So at some points, I was just thinking that it just kind of felt like Thomas Hardy, and so it was all very familiar and wasn't doing much more or anything different. Um, and so that was just something that was just constantly in the back of my head. But I really can't blame a book for being influential, and that's not necessarily um, a fault of the book, but certainly one book that's influenced by Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina, um, is just so much. It feels so much deeper than Madame Bovary, and so yeah, I'm not. As I said, kind of mixed feelings about it. Um, the character of Emma is really interesting, um, and I suppose what's going on with Emma is kind of different to someone like Anna Karenina. She's trying to explore something slightly different in a way, and I think what leads her to make the decisions that she does is quite different. I think for Emma, it's about sort of living in a fantasy and wanting her world to be this big romance, this big um, it's almost like Northanger Abbey, but more tragic instead of comic. And so that's what sort of leads her to feel so dissatisfied with her provincial life, with her, um, sort of fairly mediocre husband. Um, it's what leads her to have these affairs. It's what leads her to live beyond her means. That she, in one sense, doesn't really want to live in reality, but also in another sense, she hasn't really had the chance in life to actually work out who she is as well. She went to a convent school, and then she moved back in with her father, who lived in a farmhouse in relative seclusion. Um, and so I don't know if it feels like the game's been kind of rigged against her at the same time. So it is a really interesting book. It's a book I might revisit again in the future. But yeah, again, I had some rather mixed feelings about it. And then, kind of related to that, then to Madame Bovary, I read the complete or the collected stories of Lydia Davis. So Lydia Davis has relatively recently translated Madame Bovary, and so these are just all of her short stories, some of which are very short, just a couple of pages. There are some other stories in here that are just a sentence or two. On the whole, I found them really, really entertaining. I enjoy the way that Lydia Davis writes. I enjoy her wit and I suppose just her observations. It's very observational humour, very observational writing. I think I've said before, she kind of reminds me of New Yorker cartoons, and so it's just about finding these little details and elevating them, but not elevating them too much. It's just sort of drawing attention to them. So yeah, just some really interesting, quirky stories. As they go on, they seem to be a little more autobiographical. At least you get that sense. There are some quite moving stories about the progression of her parents' various illnesses and eventual deaths, death for each parent. Um, so that was quite moving as well, and yet it was still written in this very sort of curious and still quite witty style. There was still a sense of humor there as well. But at the same time, I'm not entirely sure just how autobiographical those stories were, because I don't actually know that much about her life, and so it might just be how powerfully she is conveying these characters, and so yeah, it's hard to know. Then there's four more books. I was going to say three, but there's one I could very easily forget. The next one is The Fall of Constantinople by Stephen Runciman. It's quite hard to see the title there. And this is about the Ottomans finally taking the city of Constantinople in 1453. Yeah, in May 1453. So, I was reading this. I'm not going to do the maths, but at least in the same month that it initially happened. And it sort of, brought about the end of the Byzantine period. And this was really fantastic, just a lot of fun. He immerses you in the world, and I think that's what he's really trying to do. Is he's trying to get people ultimately interested in the period, in the subject matter, trying to bring that world to life and give you the narrative, give you, sort of the key facts of what happened. And then later on, towards the end of the book, he sort of wrestles with the sources a bit. He sort of goes through why he used particular people, and sort of what to think of other sources. Um, and yeah, it was just a lot of fun. He gives you the sort of background on what the state of the Byzantine Empire, Prior to the siege, essentially it was just the city of Constantinople was all that was left. He gives you a bit of background on the Ottomans and the changes going on in their sort of power structures and their ambitions that sort of made this possible. And it sort of gave me. I had a question as I was reading it, and essentially with the Byzantines, they didn't really have anything left. They had barely any money. They couldn't really pay for mercenaries or for weapons, for cannons and things like that. And so any help that they did get was paid for from outside powers, particularly by the papacy. Um, and so they had nothing. And it seems like the Ottomans were so hell bent on taking Constantinople, and the question came up for me. Well, why? Because at least in terms of um, any um, possible loot or riches, that there'd be some obviously in sort of private families and things like that, but there's not much. There's not much there, and in terms of the actual empire, they've actually conquered most of that anyway. Um, and so I think it is more of the sort of symbolic thing there, and that at least materially they could have just left Constantinople, and it probably would have made an awful lot of a difference to them. But again, I think they called the city the bone in Allah's throat, and so it was just it was just that one little annoyance that they had to get rid of. They had to be had to be completists, I suppose. So yeah, just a fascinating book that, at least for me, got me asking questions and sort of working out what I thought of the whole situation. But just a fascinating period, and yeah, I mean, I'm really intrigued by both Byzantine and Ottoman culture and history. Then next up, we've got Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. This is a relatively new translation by Olena Bormashenko. Bormashenko. I again really enjoyed this. It's set on Earth after aliens have visited Earth, and essentially they've just dropped down in sort of various places on the planet, some more remote than others. Um, and after the aliens have left, they call these areas the zones, and lots of alien junk has been left in these zones, and also the laws of physics have kind of been altered as well, and they're quite dangerous places to go to, and so scientists are trying to work out how to best utilize this alien technology, but also it's sort of all fenced off, and they're trying to keep unauthorized people out for their own safety, but also so they can control who has access to this technology and who doesn't. Um, and then, so the story is set around one particular zone, and this zone is sort of in the industrial area, sort of on the edge of a town, and so it's changed the life of this town forever. And there are people who sneak into the zone, and they call themselves, or have been called, stalkers, and it's just the story of one particular stalker called Red, and his rather complicated history with the zones. When he goes in there, it's always a very uh, quite terrifying experience for him, and yet he's the experienced one, and he's the one who has to show character, and strength, um, and it's just kind of seeing how his relationship to the zone changes over time, how society's relationship to the zone changes over time. And I think just the almost religious hope that people attach to some of this technology and to the fact that aliens have visited us, and then that's kind of offset with this kind of irony that yes, aliens visited us and left this technology behind, but also they just weren't aware that we were here, or they didn't really think we were worth contacting, and that the stuff that they've left behind um, is just litter, is just junk. Uh, so yeah, it's just a really interesting book. I really enjoyed it. And then the one book that I don't actually have physically with me to show you, but a book that I read. I went to visit my parents, and my dad had a few books around that he thought I might be interested in reading, and I read one of them just in one sitting, and that was the Sick Bag Song by Nick Cave, one of my favourite musicians. And I've never read any of his writing. He's read a few. He's written a few novels. I think his sort of collected lyrics have been published as well, and things like that. And so I was intrigued to see what this book was like, because it's essentially a um, kind of a long poem. It's sort of part poetry, part travel diary, part dream diary. It's surreal and all over the place. I'd say that people who are fans of Nick Cave's lyrics would be would enjoy it. It feels like the universe that his songs are set in. Um, for anyone who wants to know what his novels are like and what his sort of, his voice as a fiction writer is like, I'm not sure whether it's um, a good way to test that. But yeah, just it was a fascinating little poem about traveling around America as a musician on tour. Not necessarily always about going on stage, but about um, just being transient and moving through these places, about trying to find inspiration, about it has lots of reflections on his influences, whether they're musicians or writers. John Berryman comes up a few times in there. He was a big influence on Nick Cave, and also ultimately about sort of missing home and being concerned about his wife back at home, and things like that. So there's a lot going on, and there was a sort of tenderness at the centre of it, which I found really touching. And it's one I might try and revisit at some point. I might pick up my own copy, or steal my dad's copy again. And then the last book that I finished was Justine by Laurence Durrell. It's the first book in his Alexandria quartet, and it's about a guy who has retreated to an island in the Mediterranean after the friendship group that he found himself in has sort of drifted apart. Some of them are still connected to each other, but you get the impression things have changed. And he's gone to this island to write about this period, with these people, to try and make sense of it. And the novel you're reading is purportedly the novel he's written. And the interesting thing about it is that he says that he's putting all of this together, not chronologically, but almost in order of significance. And so it's quite interesting how the overall story, there isn't much of a story to it. Durrell wasn't very interested in plot, um, but certainly the characters become more and more alive, as the book goes on, really, and you see so many other sides to them. And then I get the impression that, so the next two books, Balthazar and Mount Olive, um, essentially are looking at many of the events of this first book from other perspectives. And so you're sort of realizing that even the perspectives that you're seeing in this book are are limited, and it's only the fourth book, Clear, where the narrative moves on. But really, ultimately, what I loved about the book was just the writing, and it was just one of those books where, as I was reading it, it just felt like, and I think I've said this before, sometimes you read something and it just makes you feel like you're like the luckiest person on the planet to be just there doing that thing at that time. I suppose sometimes you have that, I don't know, climbing a mountain, seeing and spending time with loved ones, listening to a particular piece of music, a particular song, something like that. And I also get that with reading books sometimes, and you know, it's not always that they turn out to be my favourite books, but I think it's something worth paying attention to when I have that feeling. And just the writing was amazing. So I'll just read the first short paragraph. It's very tempting to read more, but this is the first paragraph. The sea is high again today, with a thrilling flush of wind. In the midst of winter, you can feel the inventions of spring. A sky of hot, nude pearl until midday, crickets in sheltered places, and now the wind unpacking the great plains, ransacking the great plains. So yeah, just a wonderfully written book. And it is worth saying that the Alexandria presented in the book is very much an imagined city. There's certainly a lot of exoticism going on there, but it's just fascinating nonetheless, and it's just a book that feels like a luxury to be spending that time reading it. And that's everything that I've finished. I'll quickly sort of segue through with the books that I'm currently working on. One of them is poems by Elizabeth Bishop's, her sort of collected poems. I've very nearly finished this now. I'm just at the back going through some uncollected translations, and it's also got some poems that were never published and were just left as sort of notes and manuscripts that they found. I can never say that. Can never say that on camera. After she died, and I made a Poetry Thursday video about Elizabeth Bishop. It's been a wonderful chance to reevaluate her as a poet, and although I didn't particularly get her the first time round, I've really enjoyed reading her the second time round, and just really appreciate her as a poet now, and we'll certainly be going back to her again in the future. I've also been reading The Pillow Book by Shōnagon. This is a Classics and Company project. It's their sort of choice for mid-May through to the end of June. And so I've been reading along with that, and I'm their sort of co-host for this book. And it's on the whole, what I'm enjoying in this, because it's kind of a mix. Sometimes there are lists of things that she finds moving or annoying. Sometimes there are anecdotes of court life and just the sort of banter and conversations she has with certain officials. And then there are just these wonderful just descriptions of place, of imagined scenes and things like that. And for me, they're the standout moments. So yeah, a really interesting one. And we'll see what the rest has. I'm about halfway through that. And then I also picked up Balthazar. So this is the second book in the Alexandria Quartet. So far, about sort of 70 odd pages through. The writing is just as wonderful as the first part, so I'm very much enjoying it. And then very quickly, I appreciate it's been a little while now, I'll go through the books that I want to read in June. Once I have finished with Elizabeth Bishop, I'd like to pick up the new selected poems of Elizabeth Jennings, a poet that I've enjoyed in small doses. I haven't had much of her to read. There's just been sort of a few poems in anthologies and things like that. So I'm looking forward to getting to know what her poetry is like, and hopefully I'll be able to share that a bit with you for a Poetry Thursday or something like that. And then this is where it gets a bit over ambitious. There are two sort of group reads, read-alongs in June that I've noticed, and I was feeling conflicted as to which to join. And I think this next one is the one that's won out for the time being. People are reading Dune in June, reading Frank Herbert's Dune. I've never read it before. It's been sat on the shelf for ages. I'm very interested in reading it, and so I thought I'll just go for it and read along. It's about 500 pages, and we'll just see how it goes. The other one, and the reason I decided to go with June is because this next one is a sort of a 2-month long read along of a book that I've read before. And so I think I can either catch up or I can just read it in smaller snippets. We'll see how it goes. But Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, from Big Hard Books and Classics, and Greg from Another Bibliophile Reads, are both hosting a read along of James Joyce's Ulysses in June and July. And so I'd quite like to join them for that. Again, as I said, I've read it before. I'm hoping that I'll be able to read it a little slower than I did last time and see what comes from reading it at a slower pace. And then very quickly, two other books, two non-fiction books that I might want to pick up should I finish the Pillow book at some point. One would be From the Holy Mountain by William Dalrymple. This is part history, part travel writing, as I understand it, about the Levant, about sort of countries like I think Syria, sort of Palestine / Israel, Egypt, sort of that part of the world, Lebanon, I suppose, as well. And it says a journey in the shadow of Byzantium, and it's looking, I think, at there's no synopsis here, so I'm just guessing and just sort of going off what I've heard from sort of snatches here and there, that it's about Eastern Christianity and how that impacted that part of the world and the communities that may still be there in that part of the world, I think. And then finally, A Time to Keep Silence by Patrick Leigh Fermor. Just again, a writer, I just love his writing. I find his presence on the page just really relaxing and refreshing. And this is a very short book about monasteries. And so it'll be one that'll be easy to fit in. And so again, there are no set plans. I might end up reading other things. Certainly, if May is a kind of an example to go by, I might find myself twiddling my thumbs and changing my plans. So we'll see how it goes. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I will leave it there. It's marginally shorter than the last version of this that I filmed. So if you got to this point, thanks very much for watching. I hope you have a great great day, great weekend, great rest of the month, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.